Okay, so while he gives his credentials and it's all background information, not really getting into the meat of the case, let's try to get some perspective on this. Joining me right now is Law&Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, good morning to you.
Jesse, good morning.
Let's talk a little bit about this case. What do you expect for today? Yesterday was a really difficult day in the court with first responders talking about what they saw.
Yeah.
We heard details of the room. Really difficult day for everybody, including the jury. What do you expect today?
You know, one of the major hurdles in this case for the defense, and let me backtrack. We expect this defendant to put forth an intoxication defense because apparently she might be on drugs and that could lead to some sort of like diminished capacity, and that's fine. But the facts are so egregious, and of course the prosecution is going to want to go through the state of this infant's body when it was found, that it almost takes your breath away. And I imagine the people sitting in the jury are going to have a tough time when you hear those facts, and then to not find somebody guilty of causing the state of this baby is going to be a very big hurdle.
Is it a question of guilt versus guilty of something lesser? You know, maybe is the idea here for the defense to say, hey, she's guilty, but not of murder?
I suppose maybe that's what they're, if they get something less than first-degree murder in this case, I suppose that's a win for the defense. But that's not, I think they're going all or nothing here. I could be wrong. We'll see how it progresses. But it's just really hard for the jury to hear that and not hold somebody accountable.
It's hard for everybody. It's hard for everybody to hear the details of this. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be live in the courtroom. Jonna, what do you think it's like investigating this case?
This has to be one of the most horrific scenes any of these seasoned investigators have come upon. But you and I had a question while this testimony is going on. We're talking about the temperature of the room. So obviously we know when the day they found this child, the room temperature was pretty warm. Where's the prosecution going with this? Are they going to try to say that they never air conditioned the room for this child and that contributed to his death? Because the day that they find the child doesn't necessarily mean that the week prior, because he didn't die that day, that the room was a certain temperature. At
the end of the day, his room was hotter than all the others, and he was left in there in his own filth. I mean, that's the big fact right here. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be live in this courtroom, and we obviously have a lot more to talk about. We'll be right back. Well, John, it appears to me that there was food and resources for everybody else, and baby Sterling had diapers and food and blankets in his house, and everybody else was taken care of, but he wasn't. What are you getting from a review of their house, their apartment?
Well, first of all, it's bizarre, because they had everything that they needed to take care of this baby, yet they obviously didn't take care of this baby. So what happened there? They had another child who's completely fine, unharmed in any way. It doesn't make sense that they singled out this 4-month-old infant. And I was reading some stuff when we were watching this. That child could have been sitting in that swing for up to 2 weeks in his own filth. And those maggots were around him while he was still alive, Jesse. It wasn't that he passed and then, because that typically happens. It makes it even more infuriating.
It's just awful. Just awful, awful, awful. And yeah, there's no words. There's really no words to even describe it. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be live in that courtroom. Stay tuned. Okay, let's break some of this down right now. Jonna, is there any way, how can the defense show that this neglect, I mean, really, he was neglected, is not intentional, that it wasn't deliberate, that this perhaps, as she claims, this is an issue of mental health? How can the defense really prove this?
You know, one of the biggest hurdles the defense is going to have to overcome, Jesse, is that this incident, the death of this child, did not happen in a 5-minute window. It may not have happened in a 5-day window. It's possible that they neglected this child, she and the father of this child, for such a long period of time that there really is going to be no excuse. Even the intoxication defense that we think she's going to mount, Does that cover a 2-week period of time? That might cover a day. That might cover 2. But this is a whole different ball of wax here. I don't know how the defense is going to do it.
And I want to also ask you on after our next break about the idea of postpartum depression, how that files into it. We had Dr. John Huber on earlier to talk about the effects of it, but I'd like to get a legal perspective from you. So what we're going to do is we are going to take a break. When we come back, we'll be live in that courtroom. But we have so much more to talk about in this case. She is charged with murder and child endangerment resulting in the death of this 4-month-old baby. You are looking at the crime scene photos and understanding what the layout of this whole house is. So we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime. We have a lot to cover. Jonna, you know, we can't help but think about the jury here. You know, we're talking about 10 men, 4 women who are sitting on this jury.
Yeah.
What kind of jury do you want if you're the defense?
Oh, if you're the defense, I think, number 1, you want some moms on the jury. Number 2, you may even want people on the jury, if you can get them, that have some sort of medical background, because one of the things that's going to come up is the potential for postpartum depression here, and it's good to have an understanding.
I want to talk more about that, but right now the witness is back on the stand, so let's go live. Okay, so they seem to be examining the point that there was food and resources for everybody else in the house, but what happened to baby Sterling? Back here with Jonna Spilbor, that's a good point, but also I want to go back to postpartum depression because we haven't had a chance to talk about it. Really, will that be a real factor here in this case as a defense?
Well, it provides the potential for basically an incapacity defense or a lack of mens rea. When you have a case like this where a child was neglected, obviously for so long, the jury is going to need some explanation for it other than what the prosecution wants to prove, just that they were neglectful parents and intended to kill this child. So I think it could come into play in a big way here.
You're saying that it wasn't intentional, it wasn't planned to neglect the child, but isn't neglect, one argument, as Judge Ashley Wilcott said yesterday, neglect in her opinion is always intentional?
Well, if they do present a postpartum defense, what the defense will go for is that this person lacked the mens rea, like she did not intend, because she was mentally incapacitated based on a physical condition, which of course they'll need experts to prove, that she lacked the mens rea to murder. Now, but she's also charged with neglect, so it's not going to get her completely home free here.
Murder and child endangerment resulting in the death of the child. Let's take, I believe we have to take a quick break. Yes, so let's take that break. When we come back, we'll be live in that courtroom, and clearly there is much more to analyze. We'll be right back. Okay, I'm back here with Jonna Spilbor, and I want to ask you these questions. How could it not be deliberate? How could it be not a deliberate neglect if they had the resources to take care of this baby? And as you said earlier, the baby might have been left in there for days, maybe even weeks, unattended. The question is, if all the baby formula, the blankets, the diapers were in the room with him, if everybody else in the house was being fed, and that's what they showed look at all the food in the whole apartment, how could this not be deliberate?
Well, exactly, right? And that's what 12 people are going to be considering. That's what we're considering. But because we haven't heard the defense put forth any sort of what I think is going to be an affirmative defense here, whether it was the defense of intoxication because these parents may have been on drugs, and or whether the postpartum depression is going to play into a mental defense. Do you remember the Andrea Yates case by any chance?
I don't.
Andrea Yates was a mother of 5. With a history of severe mental illness. She killed all 5 of her children, not guilty by reason of insanity. I think this defense is going to go for some sort of mental incapacity defense.
But that's insanity. That's a totally different thing here.
Postpartum depression is a form of that. That's what this defense will
But if they had a child, they had another child, a 2-year-old who was healthy and was okay, and they're able to live their lives, they're able to do function, it seems that they just didn't take care of this baby. I mean,
that's what it seems. So I'm sure when they get the postpartum expert in there, there's going to be some connection between suffering from postpartum depression and the focus of that depression being one particular child.
Tell me how this plays into the case. It's believed that she might have suffered from postpartum depression when she had the first child, was taking medication and didn't want to take it anymore because she said it made her sick.
Right.
So the fact, if it's true she had this for the first child and then had it again for the second child, wouldn't that have been a warning? Hey, watch out.
Well, now you have to be careful, Jesse, because there are plenty of people who have multiple children and they can suffer from postpartum depression. For whatever reason, if she did and she didn't want to get treatment, that actually may help in her defense. There's no requirement that you get treatment for it. So if the defense wants to prove that she should have gotten treatment and she didn't for whatever reason, the jury will consider that too. Now, look. This is a tough road to hoe. I don't think there's any person on that jury that's going to give this woman a pass no matter what. But we're not there yet. We're in the very beginning stages of this.
And I don't mean to suggest that anybody who does suffer from postpartum depression would do anything like this, but maybe that's the counter-argument. Is the counter-argument saying, hey, listen, you can't find that as a scapegoat. There's tons of people who suffer from this, and is it fair for you to use that as a defense to not taking care of your baby?
That's a great point, but you have to remember that the expert will hopefully testify that postpartum depression is a real thing, and it changes the chemical makeup of a mother's mind. And when you're talking about a case, especially of murder, you have to have a concurrence of act and intent. And if the postpartum depression prevents you from having the necessary intent, legally, you could get off on a case like this.
Zachary Cohen was found guilty of murder and child endangerment.
Yes.
Do you think this is the appropriate charge?
Murder?
Yes.
In a case like this, Jesse, with these facts, I would have to concur. Like I said, this crime happened over a period of time. It could be as long as 2 weeks. You have a child sitting in a seat for 2 weeks that you're not feeding, you're not giving water to, you're not giving sustenance to, you're not changing the diaper. Where are the neighbors? This child had to be crying out in pain for quite a bit over a period of maybe 2 weeks.
And when we looked at the apartment, everybody was close together, it seems. So how could you not know he was in trouble?
Right. What is the excuse for the father? I mean, the mother may have a scientific defense here. The father who was found guilty, he has no excuse.
Okay, well, his defense was that it wasn't my fault, it was her fault. That didn't work out so well for him.
No wonder.
He was found guilty.
As he should have been.
But now she has a different kind of avenue,
She's
a
totally
different kind of defense, and we have to see which way that ultimately goes.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, I think we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, if they're not back from their morning break, we are going to analyze more of the testimony from the Cheyanne Harris trial. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Law&Crime, everybody. We're talking about the Cheyanne Harris case right now. It's currently on a mid-morning break. They can come back any moment. So right now we're talking a little bit more about this trial. And joining me, of course, is Law&Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, one of the there's a lot to talk about, obviously, with this case, but we're talking about potential defenses. We talked about how Zachary Cohen blamed Cheyanne Harris, right?
Right.
Do you get the sense that they're going to throw the blame on him at all? I mean, can they, from a legal point of view? I mean, this guy was just found guilty. Or they didn't even want to mention that. Can they mention that to the jury?
Typically, they cannot. I was actually scratching my head and wondering if maybe he would be testifying for the prosecution in this case, but that might be a little iffy because I'm sure he's appealing his sentence. And it's two totally different lines of defenses here. You can't legitimately point the finger. If we live together and somebody's suffering from postpartum depression or some sort of mental illness, but I'm not, I can't point the finger at you because what's my excuse? You know, especially in a case like this. That was his child, too. So no wonder that didn't fly.
Well, he was like, I was working. I was kind of disgusted about changing the baby.
Oh, please.
You know, that didn't fly so well with that jury.
Right, nor should it. I'm very interested in this cross-examination here because this investigation, you know, has to go through its steps, and we're in the middle of a break with the cross-exam. And I see where they're going with this is the prosecution was pointing out all these things that added up to what could have been intentionally neglecting this child, and now the defense is going through and saying, well, wait a minute, there wasn't any plastic on the window, was there? Like all the things that they didn't do to intentionally harm this child.
Yeah, and you mean there could have been a more straightforward way to kill this child, but the child's dead, and that's the big issue here. And speaking of cross-examination, what we're talking about is Special Agent Jim Teal, who's an investigator that went to the crime scene, took photographs, analyzed them, went through what was found, what was not found, and he was on the stand for the morning. I mean, he was the first witness called, and that's when the break was hit in the middle of the cross-examination, which is pretty interesting. Let's play some of his testimony from earlier this morning.
Arrived there, what did you do?
When I first arrived at the crime scene in Alta Vista, I went and met with the sheriff and Deputy Rousel the deputy that were at the door, and found out that the 2-year-old girl that lived in that apartment had been taken to a neighbor's house. So I went over to Jennifer Shriver's apartment and actually saw the 2-year-old, who's named Nala, to see how she was doing, make sure she was okay, make sure that Jennifer could actually watch her, as I knew it was going to be a while before anybody else was at the scene.
We heard testimony Nala was almost 2 or 20 months at the time. Is that right?
Correct.
Did you notice any obvious health concerns for Nala?
No, when I went into Jennifer Shriver's apartment and saw Nala, she appeared to be the typical almost 2-year-old, 20-month-old child. Didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, really.
After you checked on Nala, what did you do?
After I checked on Nala, I started taking, when we go to our crime scene, the first thing we do before we move anything, of course, is take overall photographs, both exterior and we then go into the interior and take photographs. And I started with my exterior photographs outside of the building. And this apartment is actually a 3-apartment building complex in Alta Vista. So I took photos around the apartment that we were looking at 107 was a building of 4 apartments that sat sort of on the south central portion of the property, and there were other buildings that sat just to the north, both east and west of that. So I took overall photographs of the scene.
And is that standard procedure for photographing a crime scene? You start with the big picture and then move into the smaller details?
Yes, we always start from the outside.
Search. Did you stop at any point to speak with someone from the Department of Human Services?
Yes, one of the deputies made me aware of the fact that there was a representative from the Department of Human Services at the scene, and she asked to speak to me, so I went outside and talked to her. She asked about going into the apartment, and I told her that was not going to be possible at this point. So I talked to her outside.
And was she there in regards to Nala?
She was.
After speaking with her, did you go back to searching the apartment?
I did. I went back to actually, at that point in time when she arrived, I was still photographing the apartment. The search hadn't begun yet.
How long were you at the apartment that day?
I arrived at the crime scene at approximately 6:27 p.m. and I left the crime scene at approximately 11:13.
And let's talk about Nala. So, Jonna, there was this 2-year-old, another child of the parents,
right,
sister of baby Sterling, seemed to be okay, seemed to be fine.
I know.
What's going on?
Which makes this even that much more bizarre, Jesse. It wasn't like these parents, I envision a mother who, like I said, is so intoxicated, maybe on some sort of drug, that she's neglecting everybody, both her children and herself.
Sure.
But clearly that's not the case. And the prosecution thus far has done a good job of showing that there's all this food in the refrigerator. The other child is brought out safely.
Okay, Jonna, let's just throw everything out. You tell me, what happened here? What really happened here? Was this, let's go back to the Zachary Cohen case. There was evidence put forward that he didn't care for the baby Sterling, that he didn't even tell one of his good friends that he had a baby son. So what really happened here? Did they not love him? Did they not want him? Did they get caught up at the point so much that maybe they were neglecting the other 2-year-old, but she was able to somehow take a little bit care of herself? You tell me. Tell me what happened here.
Honestly, I think we are not far along enough in this case to be able to determine whether this really was a case of postpartum depression or some sort of mental illness that contributed to the death of this child. It just seems very bizarre, Jesse, that in the world in which we live, when people have children and they have neighbors, and let's presume they have family, let's presume the father said he had a job, all these other outside factors were there, and nobody noticed something that was so crazy that was going to eventually bring about the death of an infant. Nobody intervened here. It just seems very, very bizarre. And I don't know if her defense is going to fly yet.
I want to talk about how maybe this was preventable, but not quite yet. Let's keep going with Special Agent Jim Teal. He's going to be back on the stand any moment. We're waiting for the live feed to kick in, but this is some more of his testimony from earlier today.
What was the temperature like when you were at the apartment?
As was mentioned, we were called on August 30th, and the temperature that day was probably a typical August day. I think the temperatures were somewhere in the 70s.
Inside of the apartment, were there thermostats for each room?
There were the living room had a thermostat, the master bedroom, and then the room that Sterling was found in each had a thermostat.
Was this a big apartment?
No, it wasn't. It was a fairly small apartment, 2 bedrooms, a living room, kitchen, and bathroom, basically, is what made up the apartment.
Let's talk about the living room. Did you look at that thermostat?
I did. I looked at the thermostat in the living room for the electric heat. It was the baseboard heat in the rooms is what thermostats were for.
And what was the living room set at?
That thermostat appeared to be in the off position. It didn't appear to be on.
Was there a fan in the living room?
There was.
I'm sorry, a ceiling fan?
There was a ceiling fan in the living room.
How about what we've been calling the master bedroom? Was there a thermostat in there?
There was a thermostat in there.
What was that set at?
I believe that was turned off also.
The room that Sterling was in, that had a thermostat?
It did.
What was that set at?
That thermostat was not in the off position. It was at a temperature that I estimated to be between 63 and 65 degrees.
Did you do anything to check the actual temperatures of the room?
After I arrived on scene and was taking photos and had noticed as I was walking through the apartment that it seemed to be warmer, especially in the room that Sterling was in, I contacted Reed Palo, the Chickasaw County Sheriff's Office, and had him stop and buy a new thermometer and bring it to the scene. And then I checked the temperatures in the living room area, in the master bedroom.
And you're aware that police initially arrived at the apartment around 1 o'clock, is that right?
I am aware of that, yes.
And also during the time through the afternoon, I assume doors had been opened and people had been in and out.
Well, my understanding from what Reed told us is that once the first responders arrived at the scene and had gone in and determined that the child was deceased, that they ended up securing the scene, and I don't believe anybody else was in there until I arrived to take my photographs later in the evening.
So you checked temperatures of the room. What was the temperature of the living room at around 8 o'clock that night?
Excuse me. The temperature in the living room was 77 degrees.
What was the temperature in the master bedroom?
The temperature in the master bedroom by that thermometer that we got was 76 degrees.
And what was the temperature of Sterling's room?
Sterling's room was at 81 degrees.
And we've heard testimony from different people about the change they felt from walking from the living room into Sterling's room. Did you feel that by the time you were there?
Yes, there was, as I went through to take pictures and first stepped into Sterling's room, the difference in air temperature as you walked in there was noticeable. I mean, as I told one of the investigators, it seemed to me like it was probably between 10 and 20 degree difference. I mean, it was noticeably warmer in the room that Sterling was in.
Was there any air movement in Sterling's room?
There was not.
Okay, and we're waiting to be back live in that courtroom with the cross-examination of this witness. Jonna, you had talked to me about something right before we went to that clip, and it's the idea of how did no one else know what was going on?
Right.
Here's an interesting thing. Sterling was born in a bathtub, okay? And then after the ambulance took Cheyanne to the hospital, there was a test done for his umbilical cord that showed positive for the presence of methamphetamine. So there was presence of meth in the umbilical cord, but the state, didn't get these results until after his death. How is it possible that this was overlooked?
It shouldn't have been overlooked, Jesse. I represented a client a while back who had a similar problem. And the state came in while that child was still in the womb and got guardianship over that child. And the moment that child was birthed, the state took that child. So for the Department of Social Services to miss that is shame on them.
I mean, how do they miss that? Isn't there more communication between the hospital and the state?
Did she not go to a doctor for the 9 months that she was pregnant? I mean, do we know this information? Will that come out? It's shameful because if she did go to a doctor, doctors have a duty to report that. It doesn't violate confidentiality, and that's a problem.
And, we learned a lot of these details from Zachary Cohen's trial, including the grandmother, the maternal grandmother, I believe it was Cheyanne Harris's mother, who talked more about this and said, look, she didn't see any signs, in her opinion, that there was trouble. We'll talk more about that. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, hopefully we'll be live in that courtroom, so stay tuned. Okay, I'm back here with Jonna Spilbor. What were they trying to get at here? The fact that he took a lot of photos, but, you know, didn't show all of them to the jury.
Yeah, well, on cross-examination, the defense is trying to point out that he took all photos based on his own filter.
Right.
And he didn't necessarily take photos that were going to be beneficial for the defendant, basically.
Right, and then the redirect, they were just trying to make that point. Where do you think the prosecution will go next? I mean, we're still in the early stages of this. Yeah,
and typically in cases like this, you start off not with dry information, but you start off with the investigation to tell the jury why they're all sitting there, basically. And so I expect maybe they're going to call another state employee next. We'll see. I
got to tell you that when the medical examiner ultimately testifies, that's going to be a very difficult day for everybody. New witnesses on the stand, so let's go live. Okay, so this witness is acknowledging that Cheyanne Harris appeared sad, appeared distraught, appeared a bit confused, especially when it came to her baby, which she just found out. And it seems that, Jonna, from me listening to it, this neglect wasn't just, physical. It was a neglect. She didn't even know how old her own baby was.
This witness has been on the stand for about 3 minutes, and the most telling thing that she just said was, when I asked her how old her baby was, she didn't really know. I have never met a woman who did not tell you to the minute how old her baby was. When you say, how old's my baby? Oh, he's 3 months, 4 days, and 6 hours. Women are excited about that. They know that. That's a very telling clue that this mother didn't really know how old her baby was.
And again, have you ever seen a case before, I know we have about 30 seconds or so, where parents may favor one child over another?
Well, now, Jesse, you're probably the favorite in your family, I dare say, but that doesn't mean you don't neglect a baby, even if you prefer another child over that baby. That's not a defense.
I'm just trying to make sense of what happened here and trying to understand what the relationship was between these two and baby Sterling. But I will tell you this much, Jonna, thanks so much for coming on. I know our time together has come to a close again.
Yes, always a pleasure. This is a really difficult case, so always a pleasure to be here.
Really appreciate your perspective. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we have more to analyze, and we'll be back live in Iowa. So stay tuned here on Law&Crime.